live stream. All seems to be working. The blue line is sitting there laughing at me. And any second now. I'll have to figure that one out later. Let's see. Which was I looking at this? Did that work? Hey, we're live on YouTube.
That's great.
And yeah, we are live on YouTube. So I am looking at our live chat right now. It's like a slight delay, but that's cool. There it is. And I'm going to find my copy. You know what I'm wondering, and this is kind of worrisome to me. I'm wondering if I didn't make all these markings and then they erased the whole thing, and that would really stink. Annotate. Yeah, because that's what I was doing last time. I didn't want to go through every single piece of this. I wanted to go through sections I thought were really interesting, but looks like I'm gonna have to back. Okay. Well, anyway, just to
Well,
clarify, I went and picked up a hard copy. Hard copy, wherever that is. Hard copy. Hard
so
copy.
did I. Yeah,
Hey, all right. Because I
I
actually
needed to have it.
did I send you the copy, the digital copy?
Yes, you sent me the digital copy, and that was very accessible. I just need to have a physical copy that I can write
Oh yeah.
on.
Well, I'm totally with you on that. Totally
Mhm.
with you on that. And let's see. I was trying to find my digital copy because I thought maybe that's where I put all my notes and everything, but can't seem to find it. But basically, what we're hoping to accomplish here is to go through some history of John Taylor Gatto's writing on the history of education. So, I wonder where I would have put it. What let me just while I'm fuddy-duddying around, and hopefully you're done fuddy-duddying around. We did introductions last time, but I never really asked you the question. What you introduced me to Gatto. What was your interest? How'd you get into him?
So it's kind of funny to just describe it in these terms now. But back when I was a homeschooling mom, I did a lot of reading online of different blogs and things. And I stumbled across this one woman's account, mostly because of the name. I thought her name online was very intriguing because I had never encountered this particular brand of homeschooler, if you will. And she called herself the Libertarian Homeschooler.
Oh,
Um, and I don't know if I described myself as libertarian, but I thought it was very interesting nonetheless. So as I kind of read more of her things and became accustomed to seeing her posts online, she kind of presented a different version of homeschooling than I had ever encountered before. And that was not only were her children reading things, they were also doing things. And not to say that most homeschoolers don't do things, but she had them very much out in the world in an apprenticeship style life. And I thought that was really intriguing because having only small children, this was very new to me. Um, so as I read more of her things, at one point she recommended John Taylor Gatto as kind
oh,
of like a supplemental reading for moms as they were starting to kind of get orient themselves in the world of home education. So that's where I started with him. I pulled up a couple of his YouTubes and I bought like his talks on YouTube, and I bought one of his books called Dumbing Us Down. And it was all about how the actual system of modern education, the Prussian model, was essentially meant to, in many ways, dumb us down. It was meant to keep us um, subjugated and obedient and very good at responding to about. So that was the basic premise from and how it looks from the perspective of an educator on the inside.
yeah. And do you think that's true that this was an attempt to dumb us down? Because I have actually seen those same videos, and I think I've read at least portions of that book of his. Do you think he's correct in that?
It's interesting. Um, I think making a broad, sweeping judgment saying the system is meant to keep us down is tricky, because it doesn't necessarily address the fullness of what's going on. So
Mm,
to say that those who designed this system originally, when we're talking about the figures back in history, progressive people like Dewey or like the Prussians who originally started this system, we might be able to make a judgment like that.
mm,
To apply it to particular administrators or educators today, I don't think would be very honest. Um,
because
but
they
as
don't seem to
far
be doing
as
that.
right, I think many people in education have very good intentions, and they really are, in an earnest way, trying to bring the masses to some form of enlightenment, I guess you could describe it. But I think that the roots of the system themselves is it's very problematic.
Yeah. Yeah. I
What do you
actually, sorry, go ahead.
think about it?
Sorry.
I was just going to ask what are your thoughts about that very
Oh,
question?
well, I'm glad you asked. How about that? Thank you for asking. I am so ready to share my thoughts on everything. Um, no, I think it's
Mhm,
absolutely true, actually. I think he's spot on. I was really amazed at how
mhm,
much of what he wrote in his work, both his lectures and then the text that I read, how much of it would just like rang true for me because I was part of that
mm, mhm.
realm, for 30 years or
Yeah.
whatever. And
Mm.
one doesn't notice it when you're part of it. You don't think like I'm going to go to school today and make kids stupid. You don't think that.
Right, right.
Um, in fact, I think most of, like you said, I think most of the good people that work in the system think contrary to that. They do think about having education as being a liberating force. If nothing else, training students in skills that they can use in college or they can use in business or what have you. So they do think of it as a liberating force to a certain degree. So I don't think that it's the individuals thinking that. But what really rang true to me is the idea that people can be part of a system and do things in a certain way and not know that what they're doing is by its very nature contrary to what they think they're doing, if that makes
Mm,
sense.
mhm,
You're part of a thing and you don't realize that your being part of the thing is part of the problem. So I think that's true. Now, did
mm,
some made did everybody make children more stupid? Uh, Not necessarily, but I think that everybody that is in the American system right now is getting kids used to certain skills that are themselves not liberating, but rather suppressing. Um,
mm.
I don't know how to describe this, but I can give an example. One of my primary examples is taken to the SAT. Um,
Yes.
and I hated doing this, and yet I helped out. I administered it as several of my colleagues did, as our administrators did, and everybody thought, oh, we're just helping them because this is what they need in order to get into college, because the SAT is what the college always looks to for to measure whether you're a decent human. And the more that I administered that, the more I thought, this is like you're not getting kids to display their knowledge. You're not getting kids even to learn something new or understand something new. What you're
Mm,
getting is you're getting them conformed to you're habituating them, is what the word would be. You're habituating them to a certain type of activity, filling in of ovals, thinking certain ways, um, being timed on a thing. That's an habituation for the student, which ends up being a submissive creator. It creates submission.
mm,
And I was very aware of that, but it was just one of several different examples that I think were were ubiquitous. So
mm,
I tend to
mhm.
think that he's very much onto something here.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I think, hearing you describe the SAT reminds me of my experience handing back results of the ACT, and I hate doing it. I hate doing it in my class so much so, I've expressed that, like, is there a
Yep.
different way that we could do this? Could we mail it home to them? Because as soon as they get it, you can say whatever you want, regarding whether this is worthwhile or a tool to be used or whatever it is, but as soon as the student gets that result in their hand, you can see on their face they're measuring themselves
Oh,
against this test and they're quantifying themselves
Yeah.
as a human being based
Yep.
on this number that they're staring at right in front of them.
Yeah, it
And
becomes
it's
an inevitability.
quite awful.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, it's an
Right. And
inevitability.
it reminds me of something that we read in the author's note. I don't know if you recall that section at the beginning of the work, where Gatto makes the point that um, he says this is not based on a conspiracy. The problem that this where this problem came from was actually an inhuman anthropology, which I
Hmm.
thought that phrase was so interesting to me, and it made me think for quite a long time, what does he mean by inhuman anthropology? And I don't know if you had a chance to think about that, but I'm curious about your thoughts.
I, 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 I haven't, if I have read that section, I didn't dwell on that, but that's an interesting
Mhm.
reflection. Inhuman anthropology. If I were to guess as to what he's getting at there, it's on the one degree that the people, anthropology is a study of humans, anthropos.
Mhm.
So if you're
Mhm.
studying humans, you're gleaning a certain thesis about what makes a human or how humans operate.
Mhm.
The qualifier there, the inhuman, is either that the people doing the analysis don't take into account their own humanity. It's like I am not human, but I'm studying you humans, almost like you're studying bugs or guano
Mhm.
bats or something, because it's another race that you're studying. So there's an inhumanity to the studiers, and I think that that results in a inhumane treatment of the people that are being studied.
Mhm.
So if I were to guess at what he was getting at, it would have something to do with that. I think probably because he said this elsewhere, that
Mhm.
the system is designed in order to prevent human flourishing and to encourage humans as units, as capsules, as workers or soldiers. It's designed in order to make people so that they are easily plugged into the system rather than being a pain to the system. And the
Mhm.
really
Mhm.
sad reality is that whenever you have a system, individuals are a nuisance to that system, whatever the system is. And so humans, at our most human, are a pain in the neck because and that's just universal. We are pains in the neck. It's what we do. And God bless us because I think that if we weren't pains in the neck, we would not be constantly trying to improve and venture out and explore and
Mhm.
question and defy and be combative. Our pugnacious nature is something which is almost like intrinsic to our nature. We are by very definition fighters as well as discoverers and lovers and creators. And I think that that thing sticks in the craw of anybody who's trying to create a system, like a silver bullet to solve everything, or
Mhm.
a single definition that would crack the code, or a single methodology that will be universally applicable to everybody. I think that as soon as you craft something like that, then you try to fit everybody into that thing because your system is so beautiful. You're trying to fit everybody into that beautiful system, and what you discover is that Johnny or Jimmy or Joey or Jane are a pain in the neck. They're pugnacious. They ask too many questions. They don't want to be part of this. They're not going to take it. No, they're not going to take it. They're not going to take it anymore. Um, and I remember a priest friend of mine, Yancey Buddha, who was from Poland, who said that this was part of our nature, and God bless us because it saved us over and over again from things like socialism. He grew up in the Soviet Union, Poland, Soviet Union, and so he grew up listening to all that metal music and thinking this is not just me rebelling against the man. This is a literal rebellion against a system that is inhumane. I would guess that's kind of what Gatto is getting at.
Mhm.
That we have right now a system that was designed not to create flourishing of individual humans, but a system that was designed by its very nature to create cogs or
Mhm.
things that were part of
Mhm.
the system.
Well, I think you're right about that, and I think he also might be suggesting that thing of what it means to be a human being. And I mean, it could be more malicious. Maybe people do understand what it means to be a human being. and they don't care, or they want it to, they want it to be different, or they're malicious about it in their intent. But I suspect for the majority of people, especially, the do-gooders or the earnest people within education, within the system, maybe don't quite understand what it means to be human, or maybe they haven't yet been able to think about that question, which should
Hmm.
inform everything that education is about, in my opinion.
I think you're absolutely right. Well, education is education of humans. And so we have to have an anthropology. That is, we have to have an understanding of what a human is if we're going to do education, right?
Mhm.
Um, and let's see here. Let me make sure I get this right. Idea down. If, for instance, you said the ne'er-do-wells, the no-good nicks, right? Do-gooders, as they call them. Those folks are an actual breed in America, too. Uh, God save us from the do-gooders. They are, it is a mentality that thinks that human beings can be perfected, in my opinion. And we normally refer to those people as Fabians in Britain or progressives in America. Um, and the non-progressives are people who don't think that humans can be perfected, but that they can flourish in the Lord. They can flourish in their own personage within the divine. Um, But the system was not set up by people who think humans can flourish. The system was set up by people who think humans can be perfected. And they developed
Mm.
a idea that perfection was to be a well-oiled cog. And that was what it meant to be a perfect human. It goes back to a idea that was in the 19th century, I think. Uh, I forget the name of the philosopher, suddenly will come to me when I don't need it. But he was suggesting that the modern sensibility, which he condemned, was that human beings or nature in general, is power to be stored up for later. And that's a really interesting thought because when you look at most of the major regimes that we have condemned, the fascists, the communists, the Nazis, whatever, they all think of human beings as being malleable, as being something that you try to stir up the passions so that you can use them like a blunt tool against your enemies, so that um, you can put them into battle easily or whatever it is, or put them into the workforce easily or whatever it is. They don't think of the individual people as important, but they think of the mass, the group, as important. And that kind of is an indicator that this is correct. This idea of the progressives thinking that humans can be perfectible into the system is correct. Because I think the progressives in America have long indicated a very similar idea that human beings are power, political or physical power, which then needs to be harnessed to a particular end. Now that end could be business, that end could be um, industry, that end could be warfare, that end could be going to the moon. But if one thinks about humans not as individuals, but rather as a group, that if I can control that group, I have so much power. I mean, heck, you could think of it as if I control clicks on the internet, I have so much power. It's a force to be used, and you don't care about your individual viewers or subscribers. You only care about the fact that you have subscribers because it's power. If one thinks that way, that is a progressive way of thinking because you're thinking about the
Mm.
mass of humans as power to be stored up for later, not as individuals. And I think that that is very much in our educational system today because the system was
Mhm.
set up
Mhm.
originally by progressives, which does lead us to have to talk about his history, right? I mean,
Yes.
I keep saying it was made by progressives. So, and you and I have talked about this before, but what does that mean, right? Where do we get such cockamamie ideas?
Yeah, uh, when we were reading, gosh, I'm trying to remember which section it was. It was right before he started talking about the schools of Hellas, or
Oh,
maybe around
yes.
that time.
Let
But
me call up the digital copy.
it seems to me, and correct me if you have a different understanding, but it seemed to me that he was suggesting perhaps it goes all the way back to this divide between Athens and Sparta, that perhaps the Spartan desire for control, for success in war, for everyone to be part of this well-oiled machine. Perhaps that's where it comes from. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that's definitely part of his thesis. I don't know if I entirely agree with him, but I think his
Mm-hmm.
thesis is that we go back to that thing from Sparta. Um, there's a number of very good pieces in the prologue. The example of teachers treating students like um, they need to be filed down to become cogs. That's this first bit. And then his letter as to why he quit the industry. But this, let
Sure.
me take us back just a little bit to the school as religion, because this really intrigued me. I had
Mm-hmm.
long thought of this in different ways, though I didn't articulate it the way Gatto does. So the way that really got me, the thing that really got me, and this is as far back as the 2010s, maybe earlier, was when students would leave the school, wherever it was I was working, you'd hear teachers say, "Oh, it's too bad. We failed them. It's unfortunate that they couldn't continue in our curriculum." And I kept thinking, Wait a minute, why does it have to be in our curriculum? Why don't they just go where they feel comfortable? Why can't they just go where they think they can actually achieve something? What is it so wrong with their leaving our school and going to another school?" And that really began to clue me into the idea that there may be something in human nature that thinks in terms of clannishness and thinks in terms of a religious thought. But then add to it was, and this may be because I worked in Catholic schools,
Mm-hmm.
add to it was this idea that you are doing things for the Lord. Your education is educating people in the Lord. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad doctrine, but what it does indicate is that education is very closely tied to religious, I don't even know what the word is. Flourishing, I'll use that word again. So if you if the kid if the student is not growing in their education, growing in the religious life, then it's part of the fault of the teachers who are not doing their sufficient hierophantic activity. So when he expresses this, school as religion, I thought, well, there is a great deal to this, I think. Um, he's talking here about, was this my life? God help me. School is a religion, he says. Without understanding the holy mission aspect, you're certain to misperceive what takes place as a result of human stupidity or venality or even class warfare. All are present in the equation. It's just that none of these matter very much. Even without them, school would move in the same direction. But then he goes back to Dewey, John Dewey, in 1897. He was very prominent in the early 1900s. John Dewey really he just came right out and talked about how school was religious. There was this religious zeitgeist, as he says. Says every teacher should realize he is a social servant set apart for the maintenance of the proper social order and the securing of the right social growth. And this way, the teacher is always the prophet of the true God and the usherer into the true kingdom of heaven. That's John. I mean, this should be in italics. I think it may be in the print version, but that's Dewey's writings. And Dewey was saying it was almost like there is no religion but education, and Dewey is his prophet. Um, I would definitely question the legitimacy of such a statement. I mean, it's very bold, and maybe he was making an exaggeration there, but I would question the legitimacy of the statement. But what I would not question is that there are a great many people, were a great many people, still are a great many people, who think that their work as an educator is a religious work. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
even talking about it as a vocation, right up there with marriage and priesthood. That always gave me pause. A couple of my friends, I think Bill and Todd both, they got a little squeamish of that kind of language too. Even Arthur did, I think, to some degree. But the idea of education being a vocation on a par with the religious orders or with marriage, well, not according to Catholic teaching, right? The Catholic teaching says no, no. There are only two, maybe three vocations, right? Marriage, orders, or celibacy.
Mm-hmm.
Not teaching. But as Gatto's put is asking the question, what do we mean by proper social order and what do we mean by right social growth?
Hmm.
Um, Dewey and the Rockefellers and the patrons had a very clear idea of what this meant, and it meant basically the social order of the elites on top, the others on the bottom doing their jobs in a smooth, un unorganized, ununionized way. And right social growth is growing within your social circles, but not stepping out of them because that would be against the system.
I'm curious to
Yes.
know if you, I think about the Rockefellers a lot, and I should read more about them for the amount I'm interested in them. But do you know what they did with their own children? Were their own children part of this mass schooling system that they were such big proponents of? Or did they have their own tutors and other things that they would do?
I don't know for sure, but my suspicion is the latter.
Right.
That what the Rockefellers were funding was a system that was set up to maintain social order. And that meant that the rich get rich and the poor get children, to quote the song.
Hmm.
It didn't mean a system where a guy at the lowest level rung of the social order could be a great thinker and great creator and somehow rise to become the cream of the crop. It's not what that meant.
Hmm.
You couldn't be the great story of something the Lord made about the young fellow who actually created open heart surgery for children, created open heart surgery. He was a black floor layer, he laid tile. And he was so good at what he did at creating things that he was able to come up with a way of doing open heart surgery that didn't kill the patient. And the guy that he worked with was a white doctor, didn't have the motor skills to be able to do this. And so he finally let this young black man come into the operating room and operate on this young white child to fix her when she had this open heart, this heart problems. And anyway, this young guy, he became this great surgeon, but he rose from almost nothing to become this very prominent character in history. But that was not what the Rockefellers were funding. They did not want that. I'm pretty sure of it. So if I were to take a guess, probably their own kids, they probably had private tutors, or they went to some of the best cream of the crop schools, one or the other. But part of what he's making, the point he's making in this too, is that America has always had these revival sort of things, these resurgences of religious thought, and education has been kind of part of this. So when he says here that what is it? Powerful men and dreamers became certain what kind of social order America needed, one very like the British system we had escaped 100 years earlier. That becomes the anthropology that they push in the school systems. That's in the 1880s, so 1860s to 1880s, and they were pushing something which was really kind of against the American individualism and American idea of all men created equal, but it was in a religious way. They weren't thinking I want to undermine America. They were thinking this is really the appropriate religious call to greatness. Humans will advance this way. And one last thought on this. He calls it a utopian project, right? Uh, it's a utopian project making school the only avenue to certain occupations. The intention was ultimately to draw all work into the school net. By the 1950s, it wasn't unusual to find graduate students well into their 30s running errands and waiting to start their lives. To draw everything into the school net, this is, I find this really intriguing because I think as early as the 1880s, American progressives especially were seeing education as being integral to every aspect of American life. That you were always part of this school system that was going to be perfecting humanity to become better in the individual classes where they were and have a smoothly running, well-oiled social system that would operate to the best of its ability to making life better for everybody in the system. That was that harkens back to that work Looking Forward by Edward Bellamy, which had such an impact on America and the Fabian Society over in Europe back in the 1880s. Because what he was proclaiming was a vision of the future. It's what's called looking backward because a guy goes into the future and then looks back at the ignorance of the 1880s. In the future, the system was such that it was agricultural, agrarian. It was everybody had enough to eat. They only had products for as much as they needed. If they needed more, they could press a button. It would be delivered to them by something like a drone because it was kept in a warehouse somewhere. They had clean streets. They had small towns rather than large cities. They had a workforce that was happy in their labor. They had a smaller population, which begs the question: what do they do with all the other people, right? Um, and it was this vision of a perfect, beautiful system in the future, this utopian vision, and it was very academic. Everybody was always learning, always part of us. It was almost like every city was going to become another Harvard, Harvard Village, and so the whole educational system from pre-kindergarten all the way up through adult life was part of a network of educational people, so to speak. And I think that's the utopian vision he's getting at here. But it was a religious idea. It was very, very much connected to that religious quasi-Puritanism of American society that you see in people like R.J. Kellogg, in Battle Creek, Michigan. That guy was a nutball, by the way. Made good cornflakes, but he was a nutball. So I thought that was a really interesting place for him to start here in the
Mhm.
prologue. One of several things, several good points that he makes in the prologue. Um, the new dumbness, putting pedagogy to the question. Then he goes into what you're talking about with the Spartans and the Athenians.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's uh let's take a look at that. And unfortunately, all my notes just gone. My goodness.
Ugh, I'm sorry. That's so
Yeah, I
frustrating.
know. I was so mad because I was making really good notes here. That's why I got a hard copy because I'll have to make notes in there, and then the computer can never eat what I made.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
let me just tackle the Spartan thing, the Spartan Athenian thing. The point he makes is that there were two societies in the ancient world, in ancient Greece. There was the Spartan or Lacedaemonian society, and there was the Athenian Greek society. Spartans are later people who come down from the north and they basically camp themselves in the Eurotas Valley and they enslave all the locals and they make them into their own, workforce. But they live very elite and they live therefore in a very draconian society where um, they have very strict rules for their class of people. Their class of people do not associate with the Helots, who are the working force. Their class of people trains constantly to be militarily perfect. They practice eugenics. They throw babies off a cliff that are not perfect when they're born. They kill people that are ask too many questions or get out of line. They use public flogging as a means of discipline of their own, but also of the Helots. They practiced communal living. They lived in dining clubs that were groups of people that would get together to eat and did everything universally. They um, they lived in barracks, so no individual houses. Anyways, it was a very regimented, very strict, very militaristic society. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? It was like that movie 300 makes them all buff and beautiful and all this, and they weren't. They were probably the most miserable bunch of sons of guns. And you didn't think out. Nobody from Sparta thought differently from anybody else in Sparta. Or at least they never expressed it because that would mean public shaming, maiming, killing, death.
Oh.
So, kind of like the Middle East. Then people in Athens were very different because they had a much more loose society, a trade society, a society that was based much more on the integration of one group of people with another. Now, they did have a class society, there's no doubt about it. People from the class of Pericles, they were very upper class, and they had association with the middle and the lower class, but they didn't have a lot. But Athens, nevertheless, had a much larger group of people that were willing to adopt ideas and to think and to intermingle with one another, trade at the Piraeus, for instance, the port area, trade in Plaka, and trade in the middle area between the high city and the low. So Athens was a much more open society. And his point in raising these two groups of people is to say that this strain of draconian versus, I don't know, democratic kind of came down to us over the generations in one form or another, until it resulted in essentially a mindset that wanted to incorporate the Spartan way of doing things into our educational system. That's basically what he says, if memory serves. Does that sound right to you?
It does, and he talked about kind of a wide generalization of ancient Greece and Rome, and
Mhm.
making the claim that there were no actual schools there. But then he went in and he differentiated between the approach of Sparta versus the approach of Athens. So I thought it was interesting the way he treated that. And I was curious to actually ask you, is that true what he was saying, that there were no actual schools in ancient times?
That's right. That's right. And we have to take into consideration
Mhm.
that he's using the term schooling as universal mandated national schools. That's
Sure.
basically what he's talking about.
Okay.
Okay. So
Mhm.
no, there was none of that. I mean, Sparta had what was called the agoge, and the agoge was the
Right.
training program, if you will, the training school for training young men and women to some degree, but mostly men, in how to fight. They didn't have a
Hmm.
school of geology, or history or philosophy. They didn't have that because that's crap. Who needs that? Their job as Spartans was to beat down their helots in case their helots ever rebelled. That's what they were about. You don't need geology in order to do that. So they didn't have individual. They had a mandated school system for every citizen in Sparta, but it wasn't. I mean, it was a different thing. It was sort of like out of necessity. It's like that was their way of life. It wasn't like you could choose to go to school and then go do something else. You didn't have a lot of like Spartan plumbers or something, or Spartan philosophers after they got out of school. In Athens, you had no mandated schooling. No, not at all. They normally, from what I understand, is that the wealthy had tutors, had mentors, and you had certain individuals like Socrates first and his student Plato, and then later Aristotle, and then there were other philosophers who would gather pupils to them. The people would hear about Xenophon, or they'd hear about Herodotus or whatever, and they'd say, "Oh, I want to study under that guy." And so they would meet that guy daily in the market square, where people get together to buy things and have converse with each other. And there they would talk about ideas. They would talk about philosophical or historical ideas. You had people who were cataloging things, and they had pupils, they had apprentices who would be cataloging things too. So they were learning the craft of like writing stuff down, scribe action, or they were learning the craft of oratory, how to speak well. But you never had any nationally mandated, or even it wouldn't be national, it would be political, polites, city mandated. There was never any city mandated schooling in Athens. Um, and you had people who would say, I belong to the school of this guy, or I belong to the school of this guy, and I follow this thinker, or I follow this historian. But you never had any of that mandated stuff. Um, and then the very wealthy would normally be educating their students, they would be educating their children to become politicians later on. So much of the rhetorical teaching that went on was done in order to make very good speakers. And there's actually a Platonic dialogue based on this, where he actually has a Platonic argument. Socrates has a Platonic argument discourse with this famous rhetorician. And the rhetorician is making he just talks well. And so he even if he doesn't believe the thing, he can make it sound as though he does. And that's kind of Socrates' critique of him, is that he's a faker because he doesn't really think about ideas and the like. But the point being is that the wealthy will be training their young people to speak well and be political and be able to lead other people with their oratory. Um, but that was never universally mandated. So Yeah, and then Rome,
Sure.
similar business to Athens. Only Romans, like the Spartans, looked on certain disciplines and said, why would we study that? I mean, they saw the value in history, for instance, because history would lead you to understand better how to deal with this crisis or deal with that people or deal with this military exercise. So they understood the importance of history. Philosophy, not so much. The only real philosophy in Rome was political philosophy. So you didn't have a lot of Roman thinkers considering whether or not there was a God or considering whether or not, we go to heaven or whatever, or considering even what it meant to be good. Basically, they just didn't see that as important. For Romans, to be good meant to be a good citizen. It really didn't mean so much to be holy and to, you know, live a life of virtue. That wasn't their bag.
Hmm.
So, and they didn't have universal teaching. They had young men getting together with a teacher, a docent, who would teach them the basic lessons: reading, writing, ciphering. Um, and then those kids would be going on to the next level, which I think the next level was it rhetorical? I think was the next level. It's either rhetorical or philosophical, but rhetorical was the next level where you learned how to speak well in public. And then the last level
Hmm.
was what they called philosophical, but it wasn't philosophy of like what is our relationship to God. It was philosophy as in what is the best way to organize this people, or what is the best way to think about the state, that kind of stuff. And that's for the very elite. So normally, because young men in Rome, there would be more of them in a schoolhouse, and we have evidence of this. I think actually in Herculaneum, there's an actual schoolhouse that was entombed in the volcanic stuff. Um, because there were so many of them, the docents would frequently give out the grunt work to a slave, a pedagogue, who the pedagogue would then he would just take people through their lessons. If you were reciting, learning how to do grammar, you have to do all this recitation in order to be able to get used to doing it. And so the pedagogue would just sit there walking up and down with a cane. And if you were reciting, you were fine. If you weren't reciting, he'd whack you over the head or, beat your hands or whatever it was. That was his job. He wasn't a guy who was like, what does it mean to be a two? That's not his job. His his job was like 2 + 2 = what? 4. Right. Two plus 3 = what? 4. No, that's his job. That was it. Um, and
Yeah, I loved that section where Gatto makes that point that a free man would never be a pedagogue. A free man would always be
yeah,
the
right.
actual teacher. What was the phrase? Docens? Is that what you said?
Docent. Yeah, yeah.
Docens. Um, and I thought that was so interesting that we get our word pedagogy from
Oh, I know.
the slave who's rapping, all the students who get these questions wrong. So
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
Well, it is interesting. I mean, a lot of times we have words that we use, and we either the people who use them know their origin and they're using them maliciously, or they don't know their origin and then they make a complete idiot of themselves because they're saying something over and over again, which is just, insider joke, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I was really struck by this little quip that he put in here. I forgot about this. He has this list of offenses and lashes that were given out. And this is the older version, right, with all these different offenses. Oh, look, hey, these are my markings. How about that? It did save them. Maybe the first time around it didn't. But you notice you have like how many lashings do you get? 4 lashings, five, 3, 4, 10 lashings for playing at
Yeah.
cards. Man, they must have really hated that. Misbehaving to girls, 10 lashings. Got to be good to the women's. And then this was funny. For playing bandy, 10 lashes.
What is bandy?
It's the predecessor
Oh,
of
hockey.
hockey. Yeah.
Gosh,
Yeah.
these really were Puritans, weren't they?
I
You
know.
can't
Don't play
have any
hockey.
fun.
No
No fun.
flow, baby.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then some of these are just really kind of funny. So for blotting your copybook, for not making a bow when you go home, for not making a bow when you come away.
I liked the
And
for hollowing and hooping going home.
yeah, yeah, yeah. For every word you miss in your lesson without excuse.
Mm,
One. So you get one whip for every word that you miss in your lesson.
wow.
That's rough. Um, and he said, this is what I guess he's making the point here that this is what they used to do, right? Yeah. And then there's this new version, which was done by Robert Owen. By the way, I found out it was Robert Owen. He founded this group of folks down there in Indiana, right close to us, down in the South, called the Harmonists, I think it was.
Huh.
And this is the 10 rules of schooling, which is the libertine attitude, which is creeping into the 19th century educational thought that, be kinder and gentler to kids. Basically, one rule: no scolding or punishment of the children. Second rule: unceasing kindness in tone, look, word, and action to all children without exception by every teacher employed, so as to create a real affection and full confidence between the teachers and the taught. So you got two rules here. One, no scolding or punishment. Two, be unceasingly kind. That's kind of different. It's a step in a different direction. And yeah, did that work? Which one works? I don't know. The one is Spartan, right? Draconian. 10 whippings for the getting out of the agoge. And then the other one is the more Athenian, sort of like, hey, let's just love each other and get along and talk philosophy, I guess. He's making that kind of
Mm.
tongue-in-cheek point. And that's where we get into School of Health. And good, it did save my notes. Yay. Good. Okay. So, okay, one of the things, just looking at what I wrote here, anyone worthy of citizenship was expected to be able to think clearly and to welcome great responsibility. Now, this is where I was saying I disagree with him. Okay, I know he's making a point that Athens was infinitely superior to Sparta in terms of its educational policy. That's true. But there are a couple of things we have to take into account. One is that they had slaves. The Athenians, just like the Spartans, Athenians had not enslaved an entire population, so it was a little less severe. But they did have slaves. They were a slave culture. Make of that what you will. Uh, they they were expected to be able to think clearly and to welcome great responsibility, including how do you manage your slaves? What do you do with your slaves? So there's a positive and negative aspect to it, but I don't think it can be completely ignored that they were a slave
Mhm.
culture. The second was that the Spartans and the Athenians both used social pressure for improvement. They weren't just like a bunch of people sitting around doing great philosophy all the time. They did have in Athens, as much as Sparta, social pressure that could be intense on a person or family to conform to certain ways of acting and thinking. The Athenian one was better than the Spartan. The Spartan pressure was not just social pressure, but it was also lashes and maiming and exile and death, which are deterrents, yes, but they're also, I mean, they make for a draconian society. At Athens, the pressure was much more social, being shut out from groups of people, being um, talked about in a certain way. You weren't invited to certain groups, um, and even maybe sometimes assault. You could get assaulted for saying things or doing things. And the worst was ostracism in Athens because they did do that regularly. Ostracism is called that because you take a shard of pottery called an ostracon and you'd put it with the name of the person you hated the most on the piece of pottery. And then those things would go into a bucket. And if a person's name showed up most in the bucket, that person would be kicked out of the city for a year. And that's not like you
Wow.
get kicked out of Chicago and you go to Minneapolis. That's like you get kicked out of Chicago, you live in the wilderness because you don't I mean, you would have a
Uh,
hard time being able to go to
uh,
another city. So
So is ostracism different from exile? Ostracism is like everyone in the polis hates you, so you get to leave, or you have
it's
to
yeah,
leave.
ostracism is like
Exile.
everybody hates you. You made yourself persona non grata, and you have to go away for a year. You can come back in a year, and hopefully by then you'll be chastened. And sometimes it was longer, but mostly it's like a hiatus. We're taking a hiatus from you. You're taking a hiatus from us. We'll
Mm,
work our crap out on either end, and hopefully we'll come back together happier and be able to get along. Exile was nope, you're out of the herd.
mm.
You to go, pain of death. So exile was much worse. Yeah, and sometimes exile was at the whim of the ruler rather than the
Sure.
public, because ostracism was everybody agrees and you're gone. So you have to tick off a lot of people, Whereas with exile, you just had to tick off one powerful person and then you're gone. Um,
Mm,
Dante Alighieri is exiled because he's part of the wrong group, the white Guelphs instead of the black Guelphs. And when the black Guelphs take
mm,
power, They're in Florence. He's exiled. Can't ever come back and doesn't come back to Florence until he dies later on, in I forget where it is, Venice, I forget. But anyway, um, so that's exile. But ostracism would be like you have to tick off everybody in the city of Detroit, and then they will all communally kick you out, or enough people that will kick you out. So, and then you
Mm.
could just, go to Lansing.
What a prize.
Yeah,
What
I
a
know.
prize.
Yeah. Okay, so scrolling down a little bit, I like his derivation of the word skull, which means leisure.
Mm-hmm.
And it does. It's an Indo-European word more than anything. It derives from Greek skole, originally meaning leisure, that in which leisure is employed, but later a group to whom lectures were given, a school. So skol or school is an Indo-European word. And what it led me to think about was that great book by Joseph Pieper, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And I was so cool because I actually put hot buttons on here onto my text that I can click during our thing here so we can actually see these, but we'll see if it even works. Does it work? Are you seeing this?
I
Leisure.
just see the original Gatto document that you
Okay.
were
Well, okay, so this it takes us to
on.
Leisure, the Basis of Culture. Did you ever read this book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture?
I recently started it actually, but I have not finished it yet.
You've not finished it yet. Okay. Yeah, this
Not
is
finished it yet.
I highly recommend this book. I highly recommend anything by Joseph Pieper. He's an absolutely phenomenal writer. But in this book, what Pieper says is that leisure is not what we think of in the modern world. It's not sitting around with a can of Schlitz, in your hammock. Leisure is the ability or the safe space, we would call it now, the ability to be able to think and create and be quiet from the toil of living. And in that space where we are not having to earn our bread with the sweat of our brow or fight off the brigands, or whatever, or recover from dysentery or whatever it is. We were able to sit and conceive of new ideas, create new artwork, discuss new things with our neighbors. And he says that's what creates culture. Culture is not created when you're just trying to survive the Civil War. Culture is not something when you're just, trying to dig out of the ground a potato or something to be able to keep from starving to death. Leisure or culture is created when you have this ability to sit quietly, to think, to interact with other people. And I think there's a lot to consider there, not the least of which is that in the midst of that safe space, so to speak, you have the ability to pass on um, our discoveries and our way of doing things to the next generation. And we call that school, we call that play, we call that leisure. Our consideration now of school is that it's an onerous business. It is dreadful. Most young people especially consider it to be something that that's forced upon them and they have to go through it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I don't blame them for thinking that way because that's really kind of how it's presented. But the original idea is you don't, as a 10-year-old or 13-year-old, you don't have to go out and plow the field. You don't have to get up at 5 or 4 a.m. to milk the cows. You don't have to go and put on armor and join your fathers and uncles in warfare to keep the Jung horde from
Mm-hmm.
destroying your village. And so you
Mm-hmm.
have this ability to run and skip and play and whack things with a stick. And in that, you also have the ability to understand what your ancestors did and what they said and what they thought. And you can hear from your uncle or your father or your brothers what they know and what they understand sitting around the campfire, and that's school. So his pointing out that school itself means leisure is not, I think it's really important to dwell on. We have lost to a great degree how privileged we are as a people to be able to access the understanding of prior generations. We have
Mm-hmm.
lost that sense that somehow this is a privilege, not a right. And I think part of that is because it's universally mandated. The second you say everybody has to do this, well, you take it away as privilege. You make it into, well, you make it onerous, right? You make it necessity, and it's no longer privilege. It's no longer fun. It's just, dang, yet another day of factory living.
Well, and I think in that description, we can easily see and understand maybe what Dewey was talking about back in that section that we read together when he's talking about school ushering in a new kingdom. Or
Oh,
I
yes.
can't remember the exact verbiage he used, but um, that seems very antithetical to the culture that Pieper is talking about.
Yes. Yes, it does. Well, it does because, yeah, I think that's a major flaw in the whole progressive way of thinking of things is that progressives find this terrifying necessity for us to fix the situation. I mean, at heart, I think progressives are really terrified. They're terrified the human race is going to get wiped out, or that the white race is going to get wiped out, or that our way of life is going to get wiped out. And we must do everything to maintain the dodo way of life, whether that means going to Mars or whether that means saving the environment or whether that means, the forced equality of everybody. Um, it has to be done or little Johnny will die, you know. So it's almost like it's predicated on this religious terror that the demons are going to get you if you don't do the thing,
Mhm.
which is really unfortunate, I think, because I've always found education to be fun. It's for me, it's delightful. It's like, wow, look at all this crazy crap. This is amazing. Um, because like this morning I was listening to a podcast about how there are these stone circles under Lake Michigan and Lake Superior, and stone circles, right? Almost like Stonehenge, and pathways that the ancients used to run elk through these stone causeways. And that was before the lakes filled up after the end of the last ice age in 10,000 BC. And I was thinking how fascinating that would be, to have the leisure to be able to go and see those things and explore those things and think about those things. Wouldn't that be great? Um, But no, you have to learn it, and there will be a quiz. And if you don't pass the quiz, you don't get into Yale. So too bad for you.
Uh,
Hey, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. All right, so moving right along, because there's something I really do want to get to here because it was important. He does talk about this gymnasium idea, Aristotle's
Mhm.
Lyceum and Plato's Academy. These were all, we talked about schools in the ancient world.
Mhm.
Socrates had people that wandered around with him and other people that would pull his hair or try to punch him in the face because he made them mad. But he did generate a number of pupils that really thought that he was doing something important, something quasi-religious, by the way. Um, Plato then establishes there's a place called the Academy that he creates. And in that place, Plato was trying to take Socrates' ideas and pass them on to the next generation in one form or another. But the Academy also incorporated young men learning how to wrestle and learning how to orate and things like that. As he says, there were no classes or bells, it wasn't like formal classes, but it was a place, a well-mannered hangout for thinkers and seekers, as he says. Um, and then today we might call such a phenomenon a salon. Aristotle's Lyceum is pretty much the same thing. You get a building, you get people into the building, you do stuff. That's basically what it was. Aristotle delivered 2 lectures a day, so he had formalized lectures, one for really intense thinkers and then one for people that just want to learn some basic stuff. Um, Gymnasium, so memorable as a forge for German leadership later on, was in reality only an open training ground where men 16 to 50 were free to participate in high quality state subsidized instruction in boxing, wrestling, and javelin. So when we talk about gymnasium, that's a word they still use in Europe, by the way, for certain types of schooling, gymnasium. Gymnasium is primarily like a YMCA, um, without all the village people. Uh, it's a place where you go to learn physical activity, to learn how to get better at that. And then they incorporated into the gymnasium certain other crafts. So some schools did painting or sculpture. Some schools did study of history or um, study of literature. But it was always in a somewhat informal way. So, as he says, an open training ground. You would join if you wanted to join. It wasn't like you have to do this. So that was kind of a difference. So the idea that there were no schools in Hellas, yeah, Yeah, there were no, I don't think, from what I can tell, there were no schools in Europe or America, obviously, but in Europe, there were no schools until the 1800s. That's kind of a mind-blowing concept. But the whole
Mm.
idea of a school didn't really even exist until the 1800s, which for me, when I first found this out, this was like 10 years ago or so, I suppose, back in the teens. It was kind of like finding out that the pyramid on the back of the dollar bill, with the all-seeing eye, that didn't even become a thing until 1935. You think, well, that's always been around, right? No, it was Franklin Delano
Yeah.
Roosevelt who decided we're going to put this on the back of the bill. It's going to symbolize the Masonic thing and the dominance of the Masonic order over America. Everybody would be happy. We better ask the Catholics because we don't want them to riot. And they did. And the Catholic Bishop of New York is like, yeah, that's okay. Go ahead.
Oh, New York. Huh?
Yeah, right,
Interesting.
exactly. A long-standing problem diocese. Oh, okay. So, and then we get to this. He says, society in Sparta was organized around the concept of cradle to grave formal training. Yes, absolutely. Because the Agoge had to train its young people to be militaristic in order to keep the Helots from killing them in their beds. That's basically it. And I think I've said this before, but I'll just mention it again. The Spartans, as they were, the Lacedaemonians, as they called themselves, were a northern people. They had swept into the area. They found this lovely area called the Eurotas Valley, good farmland. There were some locals, but they quickly made them into slaves. And those slaves did all the work, everything for the Spartans. So Spartans had nobody, they didn't have to cook their own food. Um, but the locals, the Helots, outnumbered the Spartans like 10 to 1. It may have even been more than that. So they were in constant fear of uprising. It was like the antebellum
Yeah.
South, right, in America. They were in constant fear of a rebellion, and it happened a couple times, actually. So in order to prevent that, they created this formalized schooling where the young men would be trained in a very severe way. And young women were trained also, just for the record. Men and women exercised and trained and fought together. And shockingly to the Athenians found this absolutely shocking. Women trained in the same way the men did, which meant no clothes because you didn't wear clothes.
Yeah.
They didn't have Nike back then. Well, they had Nike. They didn't have Pelotas or whatever it is or Adidas. They didn't have those, and so they didn't have any gear. So you just trained naked, maybe with a girding up your loins. But that was terribly shocking. But it was very severe too, because women got hurt. Women were punished, not as severely, but they were punished like men. That type of draconian system lasted all of your life. So it was really cradle to grave. Yeah, formal training, absolutely. Brutal society, truly, and not one to be lionized the way that the movie did, and the way
Yes.
that so many people have done. Um, anyway. He says then the German military state of Prussia consciously modeled itself after Sparta. That's a very important sticking point here
Hmm.
because when we talk about there were no schools until the 1800s, at least as we know them, there were individual schoolhouses, there are individual gymnasiums, but state mandated formal schooling only occurred, from what I gather from Gatto, after the Prussians got their head handed to them by the French in warfare. And they thought, how did we lose to these clam-eating Frenchmen? How did that happen? And, they said the reason it happened was because people didn't obey orders. If our military worked like a well-oiled machine, if they obeyed orders, they would do better in battle and we would be able to defeat anybody. And the way to get people to that point was to start them to think militarily from the time they popped into the world. We want to create, therefore, a system that will take newborns all the way to adulthood within a system of formal military training. And they instituted, therefore, mandated school attendance to a school system that was designed not to teach just subject matter, but to teach habits that habituated a person to obedience. And it was based on the Spartan model. Now, we got to pause, I think, and just kind of dwell for a minute on just how mind-bending that is.
Mhm.
Because we have frequently heard, I know I have, probably you have, we have frequently heard how education is a liberating force. Education is supposed to make you a free thinker. Education is supposed to be the privilege of a free people. But the reality, as Gatto points out, is that the American system, which wasn't always this way, by the way, the
Mhm.
American system is based on the Prussian system. It was adopted by Horace Mann back in the 19th century. And the Prussian system was designed to create not a free thinking people, but an obedient people who were habituated to military reaction. And yes, in the midst of that, you got an exposure to certain bits of art and history. Absolutely. So people brought up in the German system were very erudite and they could speak very well and they could write very well. And there's no doubt about it. They're very efficient. Um, but they were also very capable of doing the thing necessary militarily when the time came. It's one of the reasons why Germany in World War One, for instance, was so convinced that they could destroy the Allied powers single-handedly. They got very fed up with the the Austro-Hungarians, who were their allies, and of course the Turks, because the both the Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarians were inefficient. They were kind of bumbling. In fact, they started the war, and the Prussians never them for that, because the Prussians had I mean, they had a great military. Their military really was impressive, and it wasn't just the military guys; it was every citizen in the Prussian Empire was this model of efficiency and I don't know, just being part of a greater machine. They could have, I think, probably kicked the rear end of any one of the Allied powers individually, France, Britain, or Russia, or Italy. With Italy's squishy, you know. Sorry, Italians. Um, they certainly kicked the butt of the Russians. You know, the Russians were the biggest military force in World War One. They had almost infinite manpower, but they were terrible in other respects. And so they got their head handed to them by the Prussians.
Mhm.
They really trounced the French. I mean, they just beat the tar out of them. And they continued to do so because the French were stuck on the idea of we're going to win this because we lost the Franco-Prussian War, so we're going to win this one. And so at places like Verdun, the Prussians knew that Verdun was going to be a meat grinder, right? And that they could chew up as many French as they wanted in Verdun. And so they just kept, you know, holding the line at Verdun, and the French just kept going into Verdun, all resigned and dying. And boy, wasn't that noble. Um, but they couldn't survive against the Allied forces united together and the Austro-Hungarian incompetence, and et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
But my point is,
Mhm.
this Prussian system of education made such an obedient group of people and so militarily well trained that they became the terror of the European culture. Not just in World War One, they were the terror of European culture before that, both in the Austro-Hungarian, I mean, the Franco-Prussian War, and then also in the World War II. So it has an effect. It is effective, you know, this system.
Mhm.
If we wanted to create a force that was very good and obedient to get us to do some almost impossible tasks, like get onto Mars, right? This would be the system, no doubt about it. Or if we wanted to create one of the greatest militaries on the face of the planet, this would probably be the system. If we wanted to create free individuals, if we wanted to create people who flourished and who understood their place in the universe and who were introspective and artistic and creative, this system is lethal. It's like you know, uh, water on a fire or something. It just snuffs it right out. So
Mm.
it's a long way of saying that Sparta, right,
Mhm.
was sort of the origin of this. But I had said earlier that I disagreed with him. And the reason I said that is because I think every historian has to trace something back to a point, because otherwise it's infinite regress. But I do
Sure.
think, honestly, I think that this is not just a Spartan problem. I think it's a problem in the human spirit itself. So it actually goes way back before Sparta. There's no there's no green field prior to Sparta where everything was hunky dory. I think you had empires before this that insisted on a military people, or you insisted on draconian measures,
Mhm.
or you were totalitarian in your nature, some more, some less. So I think this really does precede Sparta and is more something that is wrong with the human spirit, if I could put it that way. But the Spartan Athenian divide is a pretty good one, for example. So I'm going to let my critique of Gatto slide because who am I?
Mhm. No, I think that's a good point, though. I mean, to say that we all have a capability within ourselves of leaning this way is very true. It's akin to your conversation, what you were saying about Nazi Germany, right?
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson talks about this frequently in his talks, that really haunting realization that who becomes the Nazi, right? Well, if
Oh,
we are deluded and we think that we can't become like these Nazis, right? Like what kind of human being was led to commit these atrocities? Were just very normal ones,
yeah.
right? It didn't start out monstrous at all.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important point, especially when we're delving into this really big conversation about education and what humans were made for. If we don't acknowledge that and point that out, then we're definitely in danger of veering, right?
Well, yes, and I think that's where it does become, on the one hand, an anthropology, and it also becomes a religious question. And I think that it is perfectly legit to talk about
Mhm.
education as a religious thing in this context. There's an old proverb in Rome about, I think it's Roman, where two wolves are inside every person, right? And the one that you feed more is the one that
Mhm.
devours you, the white wolf and the black wolf, right? And I think that there's a great deal to that. That with us, we have, as humans, we have a tendency to draconian, non-thinking, violent, horrendous action, and we have a tendency towards creative, intuitive, empathetic, decent action. The problem is which system is going to encourage which one, right? If we're trying to figure out what is going on in our American system, we're also trying to figure out how to fix it in order to say we want this outcome. We want people to be this way, and certainly the educational system is not going to confirm that outcome, but it will certainly encourage in one direction or another. So, if, for instance, we have a system that um, is pedagogical, to use the phrase as it is here on this page, we're going to have a system where people don't ask questions. That obedience and asking questions are frequently opposed to each other.
Mhm.
We're going to have a system where people are trained to do the difficult and sometimes nasty job that needs to be done. We're going to be having a system that toughens people up so that they're capable of extreme violence when they need to. If that's what if we want that outcome, right? If, on the other hand, we want an outcome of people that are decent and introspective and creative and artistic and holy, I suppose you could say, this system, this Spartan system, would not be what we wanted, or at least we would want to modify it, for goodness sakes. There's a startling thing I've always reflected on with the Nuremberg trials, where all these Nazis were brought before the World Council, and they all, over and over again, say, "I was following orders. I was following orders. I was following orders." And there's been a lot of ink spilled about whether they were lying or whether this was true. I think it was true. I think that most of the people that were on the stands there in Nuremberg thought they were following orders, and they thought that was an excuse, that was legitimate. I don't think they were being duplicitous on the stand. I think they actually had been trained from the time they came into the world all the way up until Nuremberg. They had been trained to be obedient, to follow orders. And so for them, the height of virtue, if you call it that, was to be obedient, to follow orders. They never once were encouraged to ask questions about those orders or to think about the cruelty that those orders involved or to, to think maybe there was a better way to live. That was not part of what they were trained to do. And so the violent wolf had been fed and the tame wolf had been starved in them. And so by the time they get to Nuremberg, having done all these horrible things, I was following orders. And they legitimately believe that, which is a very dismal lesson, a very dismal example
Mhm.
to counter the idea of having this kind of Prussian system, this kind of Spartan system, in my opinion.
Mhm.
Free men were never pedagogues. Free men were never slaves. And what Gatto seems to suggest is he wants a system that it produces free men, right? That's what I want,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's what anybody of good conscience wants. We want to have a system that encourages people to be free thinkers, to be individuals, to be morally upright. Um, Even in the book on classical education by Scott and Gine, which I encourage, I don't know if I have a link here, but it's a great book. They say that the original formation of education was in order to have people exercise piety. Piety is the right response to the right thing. And I think that that's a very good ideal. It's a very good idea to have. They're naive in thinking that that was ubiquitous in the ancient world, because as I think Gatto correctly points out, it wasn't. And I think that the critique of the modern, which they make as well as Gatto, is that the modern system of education, it runs contrary to that piety idea.
Mm.
Piety is for children and fools, right? Grown-up men and women have to face facts, face reality. And the reality is that we have to do these nasty things in order for the folk to survive.
Mm.
Hopefully nobody takes that clip and runs that clip out into the ground. Lassiter thinks. No. Um, that brings us up to this. Oh, I'm so glad it saved my notes. We don't have time to cover this, so we'll have to cover this next time. But this, I loved his analysis. And I know he's making a point and he does a good synopsis, but I've studied this era for so long. It's like you have to avoid the thing, well, actually. Because I was doing that over and over and over again while I was reading this. Sorry,
Yeah, yeah.
John Taylor, actually. Um, in brief, this is what most people seem to mean when they talk about the classical education.
Mm.
Uh, it's it's been a bête noire of mine for a while when I was trying to do design classical programs and to talk up the classical program to people. The majority of people who encourage the classical program don't really know what they're talking about. They think it's one thing and it isn't. They say classical, it isn't classical. Classical education didn't really even exist formally. And if it did, it was all about oration and becoming a senator. So what they're really talking about is this medieval seven liberal arts. But even there, that's not, they're basing it off of Dorothy Sayers,
Yes.
who wasn't really correct in what she was saying. But we'll talk about that next time, I think. I think that would be a good place to start. Now that I know it saves my notes, yippee!
No, that's great.
Yeah, I'll have to save this for next time because I've got a boatload of things to say about this. So we'll get into it next time.
Sounds good.
Does that sound sufficient to you? Let me check real quick and see if there's anything that I need to address online. Um, because maybe I don't. Did you have any other further insights or questions to stab
No,
at?
that was a good discussion based on my memory of what I read. I'm checking over my notes, and I think we covered the things that stood out to me. I'll be interested to hear your perspective on his thoughts of the Hindu schools,
Ah, yes,
maybe
yes,
next time. Yeah,
yes. Oh, I look forward to talking about that too, because that whole thing is just fascinating to me too.
yeah,
Especially its demise. But yeah, no, I look forward to that'd be good. We'll plan on that next week at the same time on Monday. Okay.
sounds good.
Good. Thank you so much, Jen. This has been quite fine, and I've really enjoyed it. So